All right, I'm going to go ahead and go into the Schoology platform. For those of you that have never seen Schoology before, when you first enter the system, you're greeted with a screen that looks just like this one. And when we think about Schoology and an LMS in general, we kind of think of this through a 5 C's lens. And we know that in the Commonwealth, you have the Portrait of a Graduate 5 C's. When we think about what that means in a learning environment, we want to think about things like consistency. So do we have an environment that's consistent for users so they know where to find things no matter what role they're entering the system as? Do we have coherence? Do we have multiple tools that students may be interacting with, or teachers as they teach and learn? Can we house those all as much as possible in one space? Do we allow for communication? Schoology's got some really good opportunities for communicating both with small groups and large. We'll be talking about that today. And another big focus of the Schoology platform is collaboration. A lot of that's going to happen in groups. So we'll be spending some time today in the groups area to talk about how we can work together and share things together, either across the division or even with smaller teams. And then finally, that 5th C is community, which we think of as families or parents. So part of the demonstration today will be a brief look at what a parent might see when they enter the system as well. So I'm in right now as Allison Admin. You can see that up in the upper right-hand corner. That's where my profile is. And when we enter the system, we're greeted with the screen that has tiles. And these tiles represent courses that I'm currently enrolled in, either as a teacher or an admin in that course, or even as a learner. So we'll be spending a lot of our time with the teacher and student lens, but I think it's important that we remember that anything that we do in terms of digital learning for students also applies to our faculty and our staff as learners. So Schoology can be a great option for professional learning. And in fact, you'll see here that one of the courses that Allison Admin is a teacher in is actually a PD course. And another one is a personalized learning course that's been specifically developed for parents. So as Allison, I'm seeing courses that I am the teacher in, and I know I'm the teacher because there is a shield that's on each of these tiles. If there is no shield, it means I'm in as a learner in one of those courses. I also, on the right-hand side, have an area that gives me reminders, upcoming events, and then some other suggestions at the bottom. This area right here is kind of your aggregate view of everything that's upcoming and everything you might be involved with. So if there are reminders from specific groups or specific courses, all that's aggregated here for you. The other thing that this screen has is a tab that's called Recent Activity. The Recent Activity feed is kind of a social media view inside of the Schoology platform. So anytime an update is posted in either a group or a course, or even at a system level in terms of a school, it would show up in this feed, but only for things that are relevant to me. So as Allison Admin, I'm seeing specific updates from Oaks Elementary because I'm attached to that school. I'm also seeing updates from the Digital Citizen group because I'm a member of that group. So everything again here is in aggregate. Across the top of the screen, you'll see courses, groups, resources, tools, and AMP. We're going to spend time on the first 4 today. AMP is our assessment management platform. That's our tool that allows us to do benchmark or division-wide common assessments, or even common assessments that may be developed at a school level or by specific teams. That's going to come later in the Loudoun implementation, so we're not going to talk about that today, but we will spend time on these first 4 areas. And then we also have a search field here, something called the App Center. And when we talked about the 5 C's, one of the C's I mentioned was coherence. We have over 200 pre-built integrations that work directly inside of Schoology. So some of those can be found here, but there are other things that the division may be subscribing to at a division level that will also be available to teachers. And I'll show you briefly what that might look like at a course level. There's a calendar that, again, would give you an aggregate view of all things that you're involved with personally and also with your groups and courses, a place for messaging, a place for notifications, and then, as I mentioned earlier, your profile. So speaking of profiles, I'm actually going to switch personas here. So I'm in a demo environment for Schoology, so I have access to a lot of different hats. So I'm going to go in now as Tracy Teacher. And Tracy Teacher is a secondary teacher, but I want you to notice, I mentioned consistency earlier. you'll notice that nothing has really changed in terms of the interface. So I still have the course tiles that are in the middle here, and I have reminders on the right-hand side. The only thing that's different is that now I see an overdue tab because I happen to have something that's overdue in one of my PD courses. Students would see this exact same view if they had overdue work, and that would be, again, in aggregate for all of the courses in which they're enrolled. I can see that I'm the teacher for US history and world history because I see that shield, but then I'm also a member of 2 courses. I'm a member of a PD course, and I'm also a member of a course that my principal has set up specifically for my school. I have my recent activity feed, but again, things across the top, all that is consistent and has stayed the same. So one thing that's worth mentioning about these course tiles, these 2 courses are ones that were created at maybe at a division level or a system level or even at a specific school. But for the bulk of the courses that show up here for teachers, these will feed directly from the student information system, in this case, Synergy or Phoenix. So the nice thing about that is that as students are enrolled in those courses, they get added automatically into those sections. And if a student does change sections, that also happens automatically. So teachers don't need to worry necessarily about making sure that students are enrolled. All that's happening kind of on the back end. So all they have to do is worry about getting into the system, and then all their courses are already set up for them. So I'm going to go into US history, and you'll see that there are 3 periods that are attached here, period 1, 2, and 4. One thing that Schoology does is it allows you to link sections together if it's part of a common prep. So at the secondary level, if I teach 2 preps, but one of those has 3 periods, I basically can have one place where I post information, and then that is available by default to all 3 sections, but I can further disaggregate that, and I can maybe customize it. So maybe one folder is only available for one particular section, while another folder might be available for all. So what we're seeing here is the teacher view of a course. In the left-hand side, you'll see navigation options. Some of these are ones students would see as well. So for example, materials, the updates area, I mentioned that feed at the beginning, that recent activity feed. If as the teacher I want to post updates, that would happen here. It would also show up in the recent activity, but also be aggregated here, but only for the US history sections. And you can see that I can push an update to all 3 sections or keep it to just a single one. The materials item on the left, that's something that students also will see, and they'll see something called grades instead of gradebook. But as a teacher, grade setup, the analytics area, workload planning, all that is specific just to me and my role as the teacher. In the middle, you'll see where the teaching and learning happens. At the top here, you'll see that we have a Google slide deck that's been embedded. And one of the nice things about Schoology is we have a really good integration with Google. And I'll talk about what some of that looks like in terms of bringing in Google content as we go through this course. But one of the things that you can think about is ways to already embed or use things that you have elsewhere inside the system. Again, getting back to that idea around coherence. There's also 2 folders here. One of them is grayed out and one looks like it's active. What that means is that the teacher has removed the published view of this particular folder. So as a teacher, I can plan ahead. There may be things that I'm developing that I'm not quite ready for students to see, so I can decide when that's available. That's true at the folder level. It's also true at the individual item level, and I'll show you where that is, but it's basically the same area. This magical settings wheel that you'll see throughout the demo today is where a lot of that functionality lives. Something else I can do at a folder level is I can individually assign. So I mentioned that I might want one of these folders to only be visible maybe for one particular section. I can also make a folder available to a certain set of students, either ones that I have already created in terms of groups in the members area, or maybe I just need to make it available for one student or a handful of students ad hoc. I have that option at the folder level. I also have that option at the individual item level. The final thing that you'll see here in terms of this screen is under the options area, you'll see something called student completion, and I'll talk about what that looks like when we're in an actual folder, but also saved course to resources. So at the end of a term, I may want to back up my course and reuse some of that content next semester or next term. This will go into my resources area, which we'll cover a little bit later. But this is a really nice feature that allows teachers to reuse content that they think worked really well and have it go right into that course again when they teach it the next time. On the right-hand side, again, we have reminders. As a teacher now, I'm seeing things that need to be graded. As a student, I would see things that are upcoming, so things that are due. So I'm going to go ahead and go into Unit 1. And when I go into Unit 1, you'll see that I have folders here that represent different lessons. And each folder has some things that tell me something about it. So I have here a timestamp. One thing you can do with folders is you can basically determine a range of time in which it's available. You also see must complete. And I mentioned student completion rules earlier. What this means is that I can pace out the learning for students. So I can make certain things mandatory before they can move on to something else. So if I go into Lesson 2, to show you an example of that, if I go into my student completion option, you'll see that I have set some parameters on this particular folder where students have to view something, or they have to post a comment if it's a discussion board, or they have to complete and get a particular grade on an assignment or an assessment. Those things can be decided here, and as students complete these items, other items in that folder then will open up for them to access and view. So inside of my Lesson 2 folder, I already have some materials that I've developed and created. I've got a page, I've got a link here, a discussion board, an assignment, an assessment, and then 2 assignments at the bottom. One says Google and one says Microsoft. I'll be talking a little bit about what the assignment workflow looks like if you have things in Google Drive. But we also have the ability for students to simply upload content as part of an assignment. And as we think about what this might look like as we develop it, we're going to go into each of these items and just take a quick look. But if you're curious how these things got there, under the Add Materials dropdown is where you can put content in that students will ultimately interact with. So that can be at the folder level, obviously, or I can make items over here. And these items over here are all items that are native to Schoology. So these would be items that students would access in Schoology and actually complete in Schoology. So that might be an assignment, an assessment. I might add a file or a link or use maybe an external tool, maybe something that I've got access to like Discovery Ed, a discussion, a page, media album, etc. And over on the right, speaking of Discovery Ed, I've got some other third-party tools. So I mentioned coherence earlier. So as we work with your division, we'll be looking at tools that can be brought in that maybe the division already has access to. But in some cases, there are tools that a teacher might have access to on an individual basis, something like maybe Quizlet. So if I have added that as something that I can access within my course, then that's content that I can then provide for students without them having to leave the section to get to it. One final thing about content, at the very bottom of this list is import from resources. One thing we'll be talking about a little bit later is you may have resources and content or curricular items that have been shared at a division level or maybe at a CLT level, and I might want to bring that content in that's been developed by somebody else into my course. I can do that with the import from resources area. When we look at the group section later, we'll look at what that might look like in terms of developing content and how that could also be pushed from the group into a course. But the idea being that if you're collaborating together on content, you can house that in another area and pull it into your course to use with different sections. So if I were to take a look at what these items look like from, let's say, the student perspective, when I click on the first item, which is prepare, this would be, let's say, a blended class where students are coming in and they're working together with me. The first thing they have is a think, pair, share activity. Ask them to talk with a partner. And as we navigate through, you'll see previous and next buttons. So as I go to the next option, you'll see that I've got an embedded Padlet. So in addition to some of the things that you already saw, like Discovery Ed or Quizlet, if you have something you're using that has embed code, that can also go inside of Schoology. Nice thing about that is there's all kinds of amazing tools that live out on the web. And if they have embed code, you can add those into Schoology so that students don't have to go to different websites to access the content. They can simply access it here. This happens to be a bulletin board activity where students can simply post notes onto the Padlet screen. If I go to the next item, you'll see a discussion board. And one of the nice things about the discussion board, as an online discussion area, it's a really great way to get all voices in the room. So we always have student discussions when we have face-to-face environments, and there are often students that are hesitant to respond or answer. A discussion board is a great way to get every student's voice in the room, even if you're having the conversation discussion during the class period. But in the question area and in the response area, you'll see some basic navigation tools. I'm sorry, not navigation, but toolbar tools for text editing. And you've also got the ability to use that microphone icon. That will allow you to take a webcam recording of yourself or use your embedded audio tool or your recording inside of your computer to basically add audio. This can happen at the teacher level, so this might be something where you are giving directions or you want to clarify something. If it's on the student side, they may prefer to respond verbally versus typing something out. So you'll notice that this tool appears in multiple places throughout the platform. It's a really great way to get not only someone's voice, but someone's actual voice or even image into a course. As people respond, all those responses then get nested together, so it's a threaded discussion. Students can reply to each other, and then this can be a graded activity, or it can be just something that students interact with that's not graded. If I move to the next item in the list here, this is kind of a regular assignment where I've told students that they can actually have a choice. They can submit some text to me as part of the assignment. They can capture an image and upload it. They can submit audio or they can submit video. There's also a rubric attached to this particular item. You'll see those that listed here. So as I'm assessing these items that students have submitted, I'll have a place to actually score this in the grading area. And then students can get feedback on these particular items. Now, these can be something that's an ad hoc that's just for this particular assignment. Or if it's something you want to track over time, like maybe it's something that's a standard, maybe it's from the standards of learning, or maybe it's something that the division is tracking kind of globally, you can align two standards. So this one happens to be aligned to 2 US history standards. That'll be tracked in another area that we call mastery that I'll show you in a little bit. If I pull up one of the student submissions, so I can see here who is submitted, who still needs graded, and then I can also see who has not submitted if I need to get a list of that. I can pull up Lorena's, and in this case, Lorena happens to have uploaded an image as part of her assignment. So what I can see as the teacher now is not only what she has uploaded, but I can use some annotation and marking tools up at the top to give her feedback on this. And you can see that every time I add something, it gives a little space where the student can see what I've added. But I can also add notes. So I might want to type in something here that's a specific, maybe specific feedback about this item. And if I want, I can even give students the ability to upload multiple revisions. So it might be that they have a draft that they've submitted. Any revisions that are uploaded would be listed here in a list. You could go through and toggle between them. And that's sort of what this area over here is designed to do. So while I can give specific information or details here, I can also add overall or generic comments about this particular assignment. And you'll see again that microphone tool. So I can, again, record myself with the webcam, or I can record myself just speaking into the microphone and give the students some audio feedback. That rubric that I showed earlier, that I can assess here by clicking on the grade area. And as a teacher, I can simply click in the boxes that represent whatever the level of achievement is here. So this happens to have a 3-point scale, while the others have a 4. You'll also notice that as I mouse over one of these areas, a little dialog bubble appears. I can add comments specifically around maybe a specific criteria I want the student to maybe work on or get further feedback on. All right, so that's kind of what the assignment tool looks like. I'm going to go back into lesson 2. I'm going to just for a moment skip over the course assessment tool because I want to make sure that I go into what the Google assignment workflow looks like. So one thing that you'll see here at the bottom, as I mentioned, we've got an American History Research paper that says Google on it, one that says Microsoft. We're going to really focus today on the Google workflow, but know that we have a very similar integration with Microsoft. So how would I create an assignment that maybe tapped into what I'd already created inside of Google? Under the Add Materials dropdown, I'm going to add an assignment. And this would be true no matter what kind of assignment I was creating. And you're going to see that some of the tools here are ones you already sort of saw in the discussion area, especially these rich text tools. So the toolbar here has your kind of usual formatting things. There's a place to put a name for the assignment. But in addition, so this is something I didn't have on the discussion board, I can add some other content into this description area. It might be an image, it might be a video, a link. If I teach math, it might be something from the equation editor. Over on the right, I have some other things I can add in, and you'll see the Google Drive resource app. I might have something inside of Google, maybe it's a presentation, and I just want students to interact with it. I don't need them to necessarily have a copy of their own that they're going to work on. So in that case, I would just grab it from here and maybe have that as part of this description. Things from Khan Academy, these are all resource apps where I can grab content that will live directly inside of here. I also have the ability to attach a file. I can attach a link. This would appear at the bottom versus being part of the body of the description. I can attach something from my resources area, and there's the audio video tool again. So I can again provide some content, whether that's my webcam or audio. Now I also have something new here that we didn't see in the discussion board, which is OneDrive assignments and Google Drive. If I wanted to create an assignment, let's say I've created something in Google Drive and I want to use that as a template, something that we see often inside of Google Classroom. If I go into the Google Drive assignments area, it'll bring up a list for me of all the items that I have in my Google Drive. These are basically sorted by what was most recently modified. So if it's something I don't see here, I can always search for it. But I actually want to grab this GA map. So I'm going to attach this GA map. And you'll notice what it says here is this will create a copy of your file for each student. So as students launch this activity and they click here, it's going to create a copy for them, for each student that lives in their Google Drive, but that they can access here as well. So they can either interact with that assignment directly inside of Schoology, or they can do it inside of Google Drive. Doesn't matter. What's important for the teacher is it collects all that in one spot for us to look at, assess, and then ultimately, maybe if we've got a rubric, great. Underneath, I've got an option to assign this to a particular grading scale. It might be numeric. It might be something, maybe it's a mastery-based scale if I'm doing standards-based grading, or I might be assessing it against a rubric. Any rubric I've created before is already ready for me to reuse, or it might be something that I want to create on the fly. So I can do that here. I can also assign a grading category to that, be it formative or summative. And then I can also, as I mentioned earlier, determine if this goes to all my sections at once or just to a single one or to two. By default, it's going to go to all of them. Here I've got an align tool. This is something where if I wanted to align content to standards, I would click on that and I could choose. And these are division level standards that my division has uploaded for me to access. So because this is social studies, I might want to grab a couple of these items here and say, yeah, I'm going to align it to this particular one. So I can align that here, and you'll notice now that standard now is attached to this document. If I had the standards as part of the rubric, they would show up here automatically. I also have the option to individually assign. So like I showed you for the folders, I can also assign something to a grading group if I've created one already, or I can again just give this to individual students ad hoc. All right, so I'm not going to actually save this assignment, but that's the workflow that you'd go through to create that assignment. And let's take a look at what it might look like now that students might be submitting and working on a Google document. So I'm going to pull up the American History research paper, and you'll see the description area, and you'll see this is a document that lived in my Google Drive that I've attached here, and then here's the rubric that I've decided I'm going to assess this work against. As students access this assignment and work on it, I then, when I go into the In Progress tab, have a way to view what they're doing as they're doing it, almost like you would within Classroom. So as students are typing or working, I can actually see them working live. And you'll see this is basically just a window with the Google Doc inside of it. So I can use all the tools that I would normally use to give feedback during the writing process or during their editing process. If I need more room, if this is too small of a screen, I can use this open tool that will allow it to go into a new tab. And if I want to see what other students are doing, I simply click on their names on the left, and it brings up each student's work as they're going through it. So this is work that's in progress. Once something, though, is submitted, it goes into the Submissions tab, and then this transfers ownership to me as the teacher. I can return this to Natalie if I need her to do further work on it. But this is also where I can pull up that rubric. So when I click on the rubric tool here, I have the ability to not only determine and score things against the criteria I've already decided, but I can use that little bubble tool again to provide direct feedback on one of those specific items. So that's what the Google assignment workflow looks like. Let's go back. Oh, whoops, I meant to go back in lesson 2 and look at a assessment. So a course assessment inside of Schoology is something that you would be giving as a teacher if it were maybe an exit ticket, a quick check for understanding, maybe a quiz. Your common assessments, your things that are given more globally, that's likely going to come out of the AMP tool. And again, we'll be looking at that a little bit later in the Loudoun implementation. But let's take a look at what an assessment might look like on the student side of things. Especially because the question types we have inside of course assessments can be really powerful. When I click on the assessment here, I've got a place as the teacher to give instructions, set some parameters around what toolbars are accessible, what the settings are. This is where I would create the questions. You can see we have a lot of different question types that are an option here. And then as I'm grading, if I have items that are subjective or constructed response, I can go ahead and assess those here. But let's take a look at some of the items that we might see in an assessment. So as I pull up this first assessment question, this particular one is a technology enhanced item called highlight text. So I basically provided students with a passage here, and their directions are to highlight areas that are non sequiturs. This could be done at a word level. So maybe this is something where you have a spelling list and students have to identify the word that's been misspelled. If it's a computer, maybe it's a computer course and you've got code, students could highlight areas where the code would break. There's a lot of possibilities here. If I were teaching poetry, I'm an English teacher, I would maybe want to provide a poem and have people highlight areas that identify visual imagery. So anyway, this is a highlight text question type. The next one is called label image. This is kind of like visual matching. I can upload any image here and then identify where I want students to actually label parts of that image. And this is done basically by drag and drop, although you can, if you want, click on it and then click on the other area you want it to go to. This is especially helpful if you have kids that might have some motor issues with dragging and dropping. But ultimately, it's a really engaging way to interact with an image. The next question type, similar, it's image-based. This one's called Highlight Hotspot. And this question is from the perspective of a world language teacher. So I might give my students a passage in Spanish and ask them to identify all the areas of a picture that are mentioned in that passage. So this, again, is selected response. I will select all the areas that are highlighted that are relevant then for the content of that particular question. This is a timeline question type. You could also use this for number line if you were thinking about this in a math context, but this is basically drag and drop. We've also got ordering question types where you can put things into a sequence. One thing of note here is you'll notice that this is a large banner to move. I should point out that everything that's been developed, especially in our assessment tool, has been designed to be mobile responsive. In fact, our whole platform is moving in that direction. So that way, if students are taking an assessment on something like an iPad, it's much more friendly for them to have a larger space to drag and drop than to have maybe a smaller area. Or think about multiple choice. Sometimes those little bubbles are really small. You can make those almost look like banners that make it a lot easier. Another question type that's an option is a really interesting one. This one's called highlight image. This is one where we've uploaded an image in the background. It happens to be a piece of notebook paper, but you'll see that in the upper right-hand corner, there are some color options. As a student, I can then use my cursor, or if I've got a tablet or a stylus, I can write directly. And then as I'm interacting with this image, Schoology is recording a screencast. So when the teacher goes to grade this particular question type, they're presented with the final answer, but then they'll also see a play button that basically is a video that the teacher can see as they watch the student work through the problem. This one would have to be graded by the teacher. That's not auto-graded. This one's going to be subjective or constructed response, but a really cool question type. Also included in our list of question types is interactive charts. This happens to be one where we're asking students to put the value of each item. So these then, the student simply drags and drops where these would go. This one can be graded by Schoology, and you can even as a teacher determine what threshold of right or wrong there might be. So you might have a variable where students can get within 5 of a number line, for example, to get the correct response. And then this one is a graphing question type. A lot of times we'll see math teachers, and when we have a question type like this, we might have a multiple choice option where students have to pick the correct parabola. Well, in this case, we might want students to just create the parabola. So we have this question type, and one thing I should mention, I know that the Commonwealth leverages Desmos Graphing Calculator. The graphing calculator from Desmos has embed codes that can be embedded within any question type inside of a Schoology assessment, so you can use that as well. But you'll also notice that on the right-hand side, we've got some other tools here, like the ruler and the protractor. Those can also be enabled for math-type questions. The student would then interact with those either for the entire assessment, if that's something you want available for all questions, or a teacher can actually make that available just for specific items. And then the last question type we'll kind of cover today is what we call math short answer. And this just provides students with an open response area. So this is constructed response, but there are different equation editors that are then optional for students to use as they respond. And the student can then interact with a variety of them depending on what the teacher has made available. So as a teacher, I might have given access to the basic, also the algebraic, etc. And you'll notice that it changes the options over on the right to be specific for whatever types of questions I want students to interact with. Again, this would be really appealing if you were a math teacher. I mentioned the right-hand side earlier. This is where we have some student support. We have an accessibility area here where students can basically change the color scheme, font size, and zoom. We also have an area that allows students to flag an item for review. So they might be going through an assessment and think, oh, I want to come back to this one later. They can flag it, and then when they go to submit it, what will happen is it'll remind them to go back and check the ones that they have flagged. The eliminator option, it won't work here because this isn't a multiple choice question type, but this allows a student to basically cross off options that they know are not correct so they can focus instead on coming up with a question that is correct. I already mentioned the protractor and the ruler. There's also a calculator option. You can either add in a scientific calculator or a basic one. And then there's also a notepad option. This again would just be for the students to interact with on their own. This is nothing that the teacher would see. It's mostly for notes at the student side. There's also in assessments a specific tool that allows for audio accommodations. If you've seen Read and Write for Google, this will look familiar. We partnered with Text Help. They developed Read and Write for Google. This basically provides read aloud capabilities for an assessment. So that's what the assessment looks like. We've kind of run through then some of the different options you have as a teacher and how you might interact with a student in terms of teaching and learning. But I want to highlight a couple more areas that are available to me as a teacher. Over on the left-hand side, one of them is the gradebook. So one of the things that will happen when you grade inside of Schoology is all those scores land inside of the Schoology gradebook. In your case, the grades that are entered in Schoology can be passed over to Phoenix or to Synergy. So there's a syncing process that allows grade passback. It's a great tool for teachers. It kind of streamlines their workflow. Instead of having to enter scores twice, something they enter here can push over. Now, I don't have the Synergy sync tool enabled here in this demo environment. So I do have another tab open that shows you what that there's a couple of extra options. So I'm just going to highlight that quickly. As a teacher, if I do have a sync option for my gradebook, I will see an option here that allows me to force changes over to another gradebook, in this case, Phoenix. And then there's also a log tool. So I can see the success of the sync, and also if there was an error message, it'll show me what the error was so that I can look further into that to fix that. So we're not going to get too deeply into that, but I wanted to make sure that was clear because that's something that I think people will really appreciate as they work more with Schoology. There's also the mastery area. I mentioned earlier that you can align items to standards, whether those are standards of learning that actually exist at a Commonwealth or state level, or in our case, ones that have been determined by our division. So when I click on the Mastery tool, what the Mastery tool does is it takes a look at all the items that I've aligned to standards, and then it gives me as the teacher kind of a view over how students are performing against those standards. So you'll see that I have 6 different U.S. history standards that I have been basically aligning work to, that students are submitting to me. And then based on their scores, I can see kind of where things are falling. So I can see that I have 4 students that are not quite in the range I would hope, 10 that are approaching, and 11 that have mastered. And if I want to get more information, for example, I might want to take a look at this particular standard. If I click on this, this then brings up for me a view that shows any, I would call them like substandards. So when you have standard clusters, anything that falls underneath is also visible. So I can get even more granular in how I view student progress. And you'll see that I have text that's telling me how students are progressing. This is something that would be determined at the division level. But the really powerful thing for a teacher is that when you click on View Details, it'll actually show you students that where they fall in that mastery level range. So what's coming soon, and I can't show right now, but will be in the platform within the next semester, is a little tool here that is 3 little dots that will allow me to either send a message to the students that are part of this group or directly assign work. So I may want to add some things into this group of kids in terms of their workflow, something that they could work on to maybe bump up the skill here. Or if it's folks that have already mastered this, maybe it's extension activities. So it just gives teachers a way to differentiate even more powerfully within the platform. So that's the Mastery tool. The last thing that's worth noting as far as a teacher tool here is something called workload planning. Workload planning is designed to give teacher visibility into coursework for other courses without actually having to view those courses. So let's say as a secondary social studies teacher, I'm thinking about assigning something for Friday. What this tells me is what they might have due in other courses, and kind of gives me a red flag if it looks like kids might be a little bit overwhelmed. So I can see right now that on Friday, kids already have 3 things due. And if I'm curious what those things are, I can actually bring it up. And when I click on it, it actually shows me what's been assigned to those students. So I can make a decision, maybe I want to give this on Monday instead, or maybe on Halloween. So anyway, the workload planning tool, as teachers are assigning work and assigning due dates, this is a really handy tool that lives inside the system. Now, I've spent a lot of time looking at this from a secondary perspective. Tracy Teacher's a secondary teacher. I'd like to go into an elementary teacher perspective, because one of the things we talk about with coherence and consistency is also kind of a K-12 approach to learning. So if I go into Tina Teacher, she happens to teach at Oaks Elementary. She's a 2nd grade teacher. And you'll see that instead of having multiple sections, she's just got homeroom. And then she's also part of a PD course. So also notice that those things that we noticed before, the course dashboard, the reminders, all that's the same. So when I go into the elementary course, what you'll see is a much more visual looking course. So one thing we work on with people that are using Schoology, especially at the elementary level, is how do you design courses thoughtfully for younger learners? So what we have here is we have basically provided quick links to areas in the course so students can simply click on the picture versus maybe having to look at text like we might have in a secondary course. So if I go into math, if I click on the math icon, that takes me into just a single item, and that might be something from ck12.org. So maybe I found a great thing I want my 2nd graders to interact with. I can embed that here, so that way they don't have to go and find other places or other links to go to. It can all just be housed in one spot for them. If I go back to my elementary area here, you'll notice that I also have a spot for parent resources. Something we see really often with districts and divisions is making the environment where kids are learning also really friendly for families. So we might have some videos that we want parents to have access to support learning at home. Maybe it's a list of sight words. Or in the case of the calendar, it might be that we have parent-teacher meetings coming up. So something to think about, especially for your primary grade levels, is how can you leverage Schoology for your families in addition to what you might have students interacting with on a regular basis. The other tools that are in here are pretty much the same in terms of what Tina can do. The difference is that she has a lot of flexibility in terms of how those things appear. So using images on top of folders, for example. Now, one perspective that we really haven't looked at yet is our parent perspective. So let's go ahead and switch personas here to Patricia Parent. And Patricia Parent, because she has a login to Schoology, has access to view the work of her students in one place. So she has two students in the system. She has Sam and she has Sally. If I want to toggle in between them under the parent login, I would be able to go back and forth. So right now, I'm viewing Sam's student. I can instead go ahead and view Sally's student. But let's go ahead and view Sam. So as the teacher, I can see things that have been posted in different areas that pertain to Sam. And I can also go into his course here. And then what I can see as a parent is anything the teacher's made available as a learning resource. So basically, I get visibility into the day-to-day work that my student might be doing. I also see that parent resources folder and an additional resources area at the bottom. If I want to go and let's say see what's happening in science, when I click on the science link as a parent, I can see a virtual field trip that this teacher has enabled, and then there's also a rubric, but then there's also a discussion board activity. Notice that the names are anonymous and that their responses have been grayed out. So as the parent, well, I can see the work that's pertinent to my student. I don't necessarily have visibility into what other students have submitted. And that could be something that's determined at a permissions level, something that we'll work with in terms of your division to figure out what makes the most sense. So as a parent, though, I also have my own account. So I might be part of a group like a parent-teacher organization. I might be enrolled in a course. So when I go to the course dashboard as a parent, remember, it's the same kind of view. It's very consistent. But I can see that I'm actually a co-teacher in the PTO because I'm one of the PTO presidents for my school. So I help facilitate that along with the advisor that I'm attached to at that school. Then I'm also enrolled as a learner in this particular case is a course that the principal has created for Washington High School. And then I'm also in a personalized learning course, so I can learn more about what I can expect about personalized learning in terms of my own students. So remember that your families, while they'll also have visibility into grades like they would normally have maybe as they access parent view, they're going to be able to see a lot more in terms of what's happening in those classes and provide some home supports depending on how that's structured by teachers. All right, I'm going to go back into Tracy Teacher's persona because I want to make sure we talk about groups. So we've spent a lot of time talking about what courses look like, and that's where students might interact. But we mentioned that there's a groups area that's a great one for collaboration, for communication, and just for wider communities. Groups are things you can think of that might address things that fall outside of the course structure. As we know, in K-12, we have a ton of things that happen in addition to courses. So we have student clubs, and we have athletics, and we have parent-teacher groups, so we have all kinds of things happening that maybe don't fit cleanly within a course structure because it's really not about submitting work. This is what groups is for. So you'll see here we have a senior class of 2020. So that's a great way to maybe communicate with all the seniors so that they get all the same information about dates and testing and graduation. I've got a varsity basketball course or a group in here, and maybe that's maybe I'm a coach and I'm going to be sharing things in terms of things for my team. I'm also part of a digital citizenship group. That was hard to say. And then I've also got a curriculum and instruction group. This is something that's going to be especially relevant for Loudoun as we move forward with our implementation. But think about this as a place where division curriculum leaders can share content that would basically be something that any teacher could use and leverage in their courses. So when you go into a group, you land in the updates page. We talked about updates earlier. Remember, that's part of that aggregate recent activity kind of social media field that you saw earlier. We also have this option in courses as we looked at. In the groups area, it's actually where you land. So this is a great way to have communication with members of your group. You can post announcements here. You can add polls. So you can get a pulse on things. For example, this one asks which day next week are most people available. We've also got a calendar option over here. So a great space for just overall communication. But most of the resources, the content we would develop, especially in a C&I group, is going to live in the resources area. And so this might be where we have things like, let's say I go into secondary because I teach secondary social studies. I might have a curriculum framework folder that has links that will take me to other documents that might live elsewhere. It might be PDFs that have been uploaded that have pacing guides. But I've also got unit folders here. So as a teacher, I think I showed earlier that you can import from resources and pull things into your course. If you want to see that, what that looks like first before you push it into your course, you can actually add it from here. So as a social studies teacher, great, I'm about to do a unit on the bubble crash, the bubble burst crash depression, the New Deal. And I'm going to look at that magic settings wheel and I can add to course. And that brings up any course where I'm an admin, and I can simply push all that content over into my course so that I can use it with my students. I can do that at the folder level, but I can also do that at an individual item level. So if I go into this particular unit and I see some of the student-facing elements that have been created and shared with me, I can see that A, there are some things that have been tagged. That makes it easier for me to search for those things later in resources. I've also got some items that are already aligned to standards. Great, I don't need to worry about aligning those things later. If I want to grab this and push this to my course, I can again use that settings wheel, and then it's simply just for that particular item. And then I can determine where that lands inside of my course. This is also where you might have common rubrics. So let's say you've got a project rubric that you'd like everyone to use because it's a common assignment. You can share that here, and then teachers can add that to their course, and then it becomes available for them as they create assignments. That will be just part of that drop-down you saw under either scale or rubric when they're creating work or content. All right, so the other thing to think about in terms of groups, I've showed you a C&I group here. One thing that's worth thinking about, if you're a principal, one thing that my previous district did here in Colorado is every school had their own group that was specifically designed for the principal and the leadership team at a school to communicate with their staff. So some of the principals use this for book studies. Some of them use this for their CLTs. We call them PLCs. Maybe it's places for collaboration. Book studies, I think I mentioned. Something else you can do inside of a group, and also a course, but I'll show it here, is something called media albums. So something that you might want to do is maybe you've got peer observations happening as part of a coaching initiative or something that's happening at your building. One of the things you can do with a media album is a place that you can basically upload images and or video that can be shared with everyone in the group, and it's a very, very safe space. So for part of our peer collaboration, we had teams that would go in and they were looking for specific instructional strategies. They would simply go in and capture that as it was occurring in that particular course. So this is another thing you can do inside of a group. You can also use these inside of courses. If you have students taking a field trip, maybe they use their mobile device to take an image. And I should mention, Schoology's mobile app is fantastic. It's the same mobile app for everybody. So whether you're a parent, central office, a teacher, or a student, it's the same app in the store. The app knows who you are, and you can interact with content. Students can submit work via the app, and you can do things like use your mobile device video, or mobile device camera rather, to capture video and upload into something like a media album. So lots of potential here. The resources area, this is kind of our last major spot that we'll stop in today. The resources area is kind of like your filing cabinet. So as a teacher, these are things that maybe I want to develop and just keep outside of a course. Maybe I'm working ahead and I just want to develop some things before my courses are really built in the system. I can do that here, but I mentioned that you can also back up your course into your resources area. You'll see here a folder that says U.S. History, periods 1, 2, 4, and 5. I taught that course last year. I backed everything up, and if I want to move that content into a course I'm teaching now, again, that magic settings wheel is add to course. There's a public area for resources. These are things that have been shared by any Schoology user, so it's not necessarily vetted content, but kind of a common place like a repository for just system-wide sharing. And then there's also an apps area. You saw earlier that I was interacting with Google Docs. The Google Doc app actually lives in this area here, and once I connect to it once, it's available for me from then on, either from this area or, as you saw earlier, from within a course or a group. So I can access this in multiple ways. The magic settings wheel, again, lets me do things like edit that file, put it into a course as a static file, as a link, as a private link, etc. So the final area that I wanted to highlight is called the Advisor Dashboard. The Advisor Dashboard is very handy for folks like deans, counselors, interventionists, folks who have maybe a caseload. What this gives is it gives the advisor a snapshot globally of how a student's doing in Schoology. So this brings up the entire course schedule. This would be whatever grade is reflected inside of Schoology. You wouldn't be using this for attendance, so don't worry about that. But if I wanted to provide some support to a student, I can, as the advisor, have viewing access to see what kind of work's been assigned to Sally. I'm her mentor, so I might want to see this so I know exactly what she has due, and I can provide some supports for her. So that tools area is really cool. All right, so the last thing that I want to make sure I show you is the profile area, because this is where a student portfolio or even a teacher portfolio might live. So as a student, I might be keeping track of things that I want to showcase. So when I go into my profile, there's an area called portfolios, and that lasts with me regardless of what courses I'm in or what grade level I'm in. It's just part of my profile while I'm part of Loudoun. So when I go into the portfolios area, I can basically upload content, I can add a page, I can take something I've submitted, and then these things can then be shared. So let's say I'm sharing with a college counselor, I can actually get a link that will share that portfolio with that advisor so they can see examples of my work. Or if I'm graduating, I can export my portfolios into zip files so I can take that with me later. These all are published, so you'll see the little green dot. Portfolios can be in draft mode if you'd like. Once they are published, they are visible to people that can access your profile from within Schoology, or as I mentioned earlier, you can always share that private link so people can see it either directly without having to navigate to your portfolio, or they don't have to log into Schoology at all. If I'm a teacher, let's say I'm Tracy Teacher, and I'd like to see one of my portfolios that a student has, I can get to that just by looking at my members area and clicking on the student. So I'll go to Sally Student. When I click on her name, it takes me right to her profile. And inside that profile are badges and also portfolios. So I'm going to go back to the home page here just as a reminder. Think about the ways that you could be leveraging some of these things, like the courses, like interactive materials. Those groups areas can be fantastic for collaboration and sharing across the division, within a school, within a team. And then also that resources area where you can also tap into things that you just may want to develop on your own. So we're coming up to the end of the hour. I want to make sure I turn it back over to Michael just for some final clarification to make sure there are no other questions that he wants me to address.